Thank you so much, Professor Irma, Professor David, distinguished leaders of Ilya State University. It's so much fun to be back here with you this summer, and I'm really looking forward to the chance to getting to know you and hopefully answering your questions. My talk today is meant to be an overview of implementation science, and implementation science is really somewhat of a new way of thinking about concepts that I think will be familiar to many of you in the room. It draws on epidemiology, but it also draws on other sciences, as we'll talk. Great, thank you. Let me just check and see how this works. Excellent. So I want to start my talk by talking about innovation. Innovations are always in the news, but what I'm going to submit to you is that those innovations, as exciting as they sound when they appear in the newspaper, are rarely followed through. This is an example that I took from last year, 2023. Several exciting new technologies available. Breast cancer detection tests, a novel test, the CRISPR technology for treating sickle cell disease and many other diseases to come, and also new vaccines such as the RSV vaccine. But what we find today in 2025 is actually not so different than what people found 20 or so years ago when a wonderful article was written by general internist Stephen Wolfe entitled Unhealthy Medicine, All Breakthrough, No Follow-Through. And it turns out that this gap between what we know and what we do isn't confined just to health. It actually exists in many other sectors. I was excited to come across this book called The Knowing Doing Gap by two business school professors, just to highlight even in a field where there's literally money at stake, there tend to still be major gaps in why people know between what people know and what they actually do. When we look at this in public health, no, I think, talk on implementation science would be complete without this very famous slide, which I first came across in one of Larry Green's writings about implementation science, which harkens back to a seminal systematic review conducted by Ballas and Boren. And what Ballas and Boren did was they looked at a lot of the exciting research and found that it takes about 17 years for only 14% of original research to make its way into practice. And while this study was done many years ago, it's been replicated in more recent years, kind of showing that that's still the case. So why is that? Well, there's very good reasons for this, actually. First of all, is that when you have a new idea, you may have to try to match that to the interests of research funders. And that may take some cycles of applying for grants and getting rejected sometimes and reapplying. And then even when you get the grant, it takes some time to actually do the research, maybe 3 to 5 years. And then you have to prepare a manuscript for publication, undergo peer review, and then wait for it to actually appear in the printed press. And even when a seminal article comes out, there will be skeptics there who want to see it replicated, perhaps appropriately in different settings, see if it can be scaled. And so for the time for the idea to actually make its way into guidelines, systematic reviews, or actually even into practice for clinical practitioners, maybe many years after that. So I think the key question that implementation science is trying to address is, can we narrow this gap? Can we shorten it? And we'll be talking today about some methods that implementation science uses to do that. And an example I'd like to give, since this is an HIV-focused training grant, is to think about HIV treatment not just as a therapy for individuals, but a new idea that was developed maybe 20 years ago or so ago about treatment as prevention, and try to trace that idea from its original conception into practice. And just to put this on the timeline, I think many people will know that HIV was first described in the early 1980s. It wasn't clear what it was caused. And it wasn't until the late 1980s that antiretroviral therapy started to come along, and only in the mid 1990s that we had highly active therapy. But a big shift started to happen as we developed triple therapy regimens that were able to suppress viral load. People were able to live longer, and people were able to think about HIV not just as an individual health problem, but as a public health problem. And seminal data showed that transmission of HIV was dependent on the viral load in an individual, the likelihood of transmitting it from one individual to another being decreased if you could suppress the viral load. And so the idea that came about from this was that would it be possible to try to prevent not only the adverse consequences for an individual, but also for a population by accelerating the use of antiretroviral therapy. And we'll be talking today about translational research. I'll give you a little bit more definition later. But one of the first steps in translational research is to start with a proof of concept. In the field of epidemiology, sometimes that's a modeling study. And so in 2009, this article published by Ruben Greinich and colleagues from WHO looked at what would happen if we changed the therapy, the indications for initiating antiretroviral therapy. So at that time, the standard practice was to wait until somebody developed symptoms of HIV or very advanced declines in their CD4 count. And there were some good reasons for that. One reason was that it was thought that antiretroviral therapy itself might be toxic to the individual. But what Grant and colleagues said is that, what if we change that? And we looked at 3 different strategies. One was just to keep doing what we're doing. That's the red line. The second was to actually set a higher threshold for initiating antiretroviral therapy. That's the blue line, a CD4 count of 350. And the third, the most radical idea, was to try to diagnose everyone and start them on treatment right away, as soon as they got diagnosed. And that was the green line. And what you can see is that there were dramatic decreases in incidence and also mortality from this overall approach. And this gave the idea that maybe this should be tested further in a randomized controlled trial. So HPTN 052, published in 2011 in the New England Journal of Medicine by Cohen and colleagues, did a very innovative design where they looked at couples who were serodifferent. One of them was HIV infected or HIV positive, a person living with HIV, and the other was HIV negative. So high risk of transmission from one to the other. And they randomized those individuals to early, immediate starting on antiretroviral therapy, or delayed according to the current guidelines, which I shared with you before. And I love this study because when you look at the Kaplan-Meier curves, the survival curves, the difference between them is so hard to see that they have to actually blow it up. In other words, this therapy was actually 96% effective at preventing HIV transmission, a dramatic decrease. And that gave heart to people then to think about scaling this up at what we call T3 research, translating it just from patients to a whole communities and societies. And so 5 studies were carried out in different parts of the world, mostly in sub-Saharan Africa, in which people looked at how this universal test and treatment approach would work. And what you can see here is that in the 5 studies, actually only 2 of the 5 studies showed this therapy to be beneficial, about a 30% decrease in HIV transmission. The other studies, they found actually there were more challenges they expected in terms of diagnosing people and actually getting them linked to therapy and started on treatment. But another thing that I think is very interesting about these studies, you can see on the left-hand side, if you look at the proportion of the population with viral load suppression at the beginning of the study to the end of the study, in every single study, there was a dramatic increase in viral load suppression, showing that the practice was already evolving as these studies came along. So I think the question now, roughly 17 years later, after this original idea was put forward, and if we think back to the mid to late 2000s, is how do we actually scale up this universal test and treat strategy around the world? This is data from 2019, so it's a little bit outdated, but there still are major gaps in different parts of the world in terms of getting people aware of their status, started on treatment, and virally suppressed. And what I'd like to talk to you about today is how do we come about doing this T4 type research, translational type 4 research, where we move from proof of concept, large-scale clinical trials to actually routine practice. So this is the reason that we need implementation science. I love this cartoon, which shows perhaps a guideline group, a bunch of academics sitting around a table, papers piled high around them. And someone at the head of the table stands up and says, the latest research shows that we really should do something with all this research. It's kind of making fun of us as academics. Many of us are academics in the room who may think the ultimate thing is putting something into a journal and get it published and have it appear on your CV. But we know that that really is not the real thing that we're doing this for. We're doing it so that we can actually scale up policies and improve the care of populations. So now I'd like to give a definition of implementation science. There's many definitions of implementation science that are out there. But one of my favorites is this one that appeared in the inaugural issue of the journal Implementation Science back in 2006, where Martin Eccles and colleagues described implementation science as the scientific study of methods to promote the systematic uptake of research findings and evidence-based practices into routine practice in order to improve the quality and effectiveness of health services. So just to break this down for you a little bit, I think I would say that much of our research is designed to improve the quality and effectiveness of health services. It's just the question of how do we go about it. And the premise of implementation science is that we really have 2 main goals. The first, of course, is in blue to translate proven findings into routine practice. But beyond that, implementation science says there's another thing that we have to do. We have to create generalizable knowledge about how we actually do it. We need to develop methods that can help us replicate this not just one time for one problem, not just for antiretroviral therapy for people living with HIV, but that we could replicate it for other things, whether it's HIV prevention, thinking about cancer prevention, or any other area. So as with any new field, one of the challenges is that you have to learn a new set of terminologies. And so I'm just going to apologize from the very beginning that there is a lot of jargon that's out there. It's one of my goals to try to eliminate that jargon and help you understand it. But it also is indicative of a field that is trying to figure out what are the principles, and people are often using different words to describe the same concepts. Sometimes they're using the same word to describe different concepts. And I'm going to do my best to help you see where the overlaps are and understand what this means. But terminology use does differ around the world. In North America, we actually have two different ways of talking about this. The National Institutes of Health, which is, of course, sponsoring this training grant, often talks about dissemination and implementation science. And I'll get to that in just a moment. In Canada, they talk about knowledge translation, this idea of moving from a proof of concept to actual practice. I was getting to a little bit in the example that I gave you of HIV. Over in Europe, across the pond, or over here, I should say, in the UK, they often talk about complex interventions. Complex interventions defined by the British Medical Research Council as interventions consist of multiple intersecting parts. So it's a similar idea. It's a little bit more descriptive of what these often are. And then the WHO often talks about operational research and implementation research. But what's common here is the need to bridge research and practice to change care. And I love this breakdown that they use in Canada in terms of knowledge translation, which breaks implementation science down into dissemination science and implementation science, and thinks about there being both a research component and a practice component. So I really want to emphasize to those in the room that whether you're a researcher or a practitioner, there's something in implementation science for you, and we'll be trying to show that through the examples that we use during the course. So as I've said, implementation science is a translational science. This is a figure that was developed by the National Institutes of Health about 20 years ago to describe translational science in general. And when I was first introduced to the term, the only thing that existed was this green section of the graph, where we were thinking about taking basic and applied research, often in laboratories, studying cells or perhaps animal models, and then translating those into humans, maybe new therapies, drugs, devices, and then ultimately translating to patients. And then it stopped at T2. And I think one of the nice innovations of this model and what the NIH has been doing in this area is to think about moving that forward to this area of the purple where we're thinking about implementation science. Beyond just those phase 2 and phase 3 trials, what happens after a drug is approved and it's released into the market? You get a lot of information at that point about how the general population is responding to a new therapy. And even beyond that, true implementation science research is thinking about the population's health. How do we improve everyone, not just that narrow spectrum of people who might have been included in an original clinical trial? The final point that I'd like to make about this slide is that while if you look at it initially, you might think of it as a unidirectional process. I want to highlight that there's cycles at every level, and then implementation science in particular is an iterative process. It's rare that when we start a new idea, when we pros and evaluate it, we get it exactly right the first time. There's really a need to learn from our failures, and that's going to be a key theme that we're going to be talking about and how we do that as we go forward. So I've opened up my talk by giving you a little bit of a definition of implementation science and tried to explain why I think we need it. What I'd like to do now is go forward and share some examples of what are 5 key ingredients of great implementation studies. Then I'll conclude with a little bit of an overview of 3 common misconceptions and maybe open questions that you might want to think about with implementation science as we go forward. So the 5 key ingredients of an implementation science study. The first is evidence-based practices. The second is community engagement. The third is theories, models, and frameworks. The fourth is implementation outcomes. And the fifth is multimodal evaluation plans. So what I'm going to try to do is explain why I think each of these 5 ingredients is important and give you an example in a number of cases. So I'll just start here by asking, and I don't have the software plugged in here, but I'd like to ask maybe some people to turn to your neighbor. We'll take 1 or 2 minutes and talk with your neighbor about what you think an evidence-based practice is. What does that mean to you? What does that terminology mean to you? And then I'll come back to you in 1 or 2 minutes, and hopefully 1 or 2 of you will be open after talking with your neighbor to share what you two came up with in terms of a definition for evidence-based practices.
And we have here a remote mic so that Taco and Mariam will help me to reach out to you.
Thank you. I'll give you about another 30 seconds or so, and then I'll ask Taco to call on one of you. All right, why don't we come back together and hear what you've determined. Do I have any volunteers maybe to tell us what you think is a good definition or a good example of an evidence-based practice? And Taco, maybe you can take a microphone to anybody that's willing to raise their hand.
Raise your hands.
All right, a brave soul up here in the third row. Thank you. Thank you, sir.
Hi.
And maybe
Yeah,
you
so
can- maybe-
evidence-based practice, we can think about it at different levels, starting with what you had on your slide with clinical trials, starting with animal model research, going through all the stages of clinical trials, and then implementing these practices, probably based on the meta-analysis, systematic reviews, pushing this high level of evidence into guidelines, regulations, but also not forgetting not only clinical domain, but also perhaps public health policy, which also should be evidence-based. So we could make policy research, policy analysis, behavioral studies, and what you had on the slide in case of United Kingdom, it said complex interventions. So the complex interventions is another, in my understanding, even more indeed complex when you want to teach people what's better behavior, what is safety, how to drive a car, or work at your workplace in a more safer way. So that's also evidence-based. You can make some regulation to have safety features on the construction site or something based on the research evidence. So different levels of evidence-based.
Thanks so much. And can you just tell us your name and where you're from?
Yeah, I'm Ilya Nadarishvili from David Udian Medical University here in Georgia.
Great, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Maybe I'll summarize what you said. I think you're kind of alluding to the fact that there are different levels of evidence that may help us determine what evidence-based practice. And I love the point that you make that this isn't just limited to clinics or hospitals. It can actually be out in the community and often crosses over into occupational health and other areas. Any other volunteers? Any additional perspectives? Maybe we can hear from one or two others. Yes, here in the second row. Thank you. Tell us your name and where you're from.
Hello, I am Luca Halaya. I'm also from David Uldian University, and I will take your approach. I will say what is not evidence-based medicine. And it's quite common in Georgia, unfortunately, that when we treat patients or when we like give advices and recommendations in regard, we often use beliefs. We often use homeopathic medicine without any reason. And when you go to doctor 90% of the time and you ask why you are doing something, why you are prescribing, they cannot give you any research, any book or any guidelines, unfortunately. And we have a lot of big problem in that regard. So I think that is not evidence-based medicine when you cannot ask doctor what's your reason and he cannot give you a research or book or guideline. Thank you.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Luca. I'm so glad that you made that point. I won't say much today, but often we talk about implementing. What are we going to put into practice? But a key aspect of implementation science is also de-implementation. There's a lot less studies of this, but it's no less important. If we think about our healthcare resources being limited, which I think they are in every country in the world, we don't want to use them on bad practices, just as you're saying. And so thinking about how we can discourage people from doing things that they shouldn't be doing is a good aspect of implementation science. So I think this point was already very well made, but typically I think the epidemiologists think about a pyramid of evidence from, perhaps when we're looking at a new condition like a COVID or the early days of HIV, we may actually need to rely on observations, case studies, things like that. But over time, we want to build better quality of evidence and hopefully get to a higher quality evidence that can support evidence-based interventions. That said, there are also sometimes practices that are deeply ingrained, maybe the way that we practiced for giving certain antibiotics for many, many years. And it may be difficult sometimes to develop high quality evidence in certain areas because practices are so established. So we often sometimes talk about empirically supported treatments as being another aspect of evidence. And I'll just highlight that we'll be using the term evidence-based intervention, evidence-based innovation, and evidence-based practice. These all mean the same thing. And evidence-based interventions or evidence-based practices are really things that are meant to improve health-related biomedical or behavioral outcomes. So these are things like mortality in the most severe cases, perhaps hospitalization, progression of a cancer. Perhaps in the context of behavioral health, it might be remission of depression or anxiety symptoms. But these are really things that are related to individuals. And a nice kind of way of thinking about what these different things are was developed by Brown and colleagues in a great review of implementation science. And they call this the 7 Ps, the 7 Ps being procedures, programs, products, policies, pills, practices, and principles. So if we think about the context of HIV, obviously pills, antiretroviral therapy is a good example of an evidence-based practice which can be used either for treatment or for prevention. There are also practices like provider-initiated testing and counseling for HIV. That's an example of a practice where rather than requiring consent, we can actually test people and help them get diagnosed earlier and started on treatment more quickly. There are principles like undetectable is untransmissible, and that could be evaluated in a variety of different ways or studies. There's policies such as like health insurance that might be things that we could study to see if those ultimately change health outcomes. There's products, there's programs, even procedures like safe male circumcision as a way of preventing HIV. Actions that are designed to improve the way that people adhere to these are something different, which are called implementation strategies. And if I had to kind of have one thing that I want you to leave here with today, it would be understanding that strategies are what we use in implementation science to try to improve adoption of these evidence-based practices. And then it's often helpful to think of these two things in distinct ways, although sometimes it can be challenging. We don't need to be dogmatic about it, but we also do want to try to define what are strategies, things that we're doing to change people's actions, and what are interventions, things that we're doing to improve people's health. So having talked about evidence-based practices, which are really the foundation of implementation science, I'd like to now talk about another important concept, which is community engagement. And it's hard to think about a field more than HIV that's really exemplified that. I think a lot of the successes that have happened in HIV have been because the community of people living with HIV, the community of people affected by HIV, by having family members or friends, has really been a key part in developing programs and policies and putting them into practice. And the idea of community engagement is really key to all aspects of implementation science. If you look at the right-hand side, this takes something called the social ecological model. How many people are familiar with the social ecological model? The social ecological model is a long-standing model, and we'll talk a little bit more later about models, which holds that there are multiple levels that we might want to look at when we think about health interventions. At the innermost level, we have the level of individuals. At the next level, we have health systems. And the outside, we have all of society. In each level of that, we find key stakeholders that may be important to try to engage. And it's important not to forget who those folks are. You know, often we remember the people living with the disease and the people that are delivering care, but there may be other people that are making products, that are running health systems, that are providing health insurance. All of these people are really important stakeholders to think about at different stages of an implementation process. The other key concept on the left-hand side of the slide is this community engagement continuum. This is a slide from the U.S. Centers for Disease Control a number of years ago. And what's being conceived of is here is that when we reach out to community members, whatever level of stakeholders there are, there's different levels of engagement. Oftentimes, when we reach out, we may just be sort of reaching out and informing them of what we're planning to do. But ideally, we would do more than just inform. We would try to deepen our engagement by consulting them, trying to understand, you know, if we're coming in and doing something new, what's happened before, what worked, what didn't work. Maybe even involving them in delivering this new intervention or developing the strategies, collaborating to getting their perspectives. And the ultimate is actually would be shared leadership, maybe in a situation such as community-based practice research, where we as researchers are actually in service of the community. We're asking them what questions are most important. And I think this idea of community engagement comes back again and again, whether you're getting started, carrying forward, or trying to sustain an intervention. Those types of partnerships can really help you move faster and understand that you're not moving too fast, that people are really ready to move forward, which is also critical. So just to give you a couple of examples, these are two examples of successful and unsuccessful community engagement from Mozambique. At the left-hand side is a famous story that was described in this Journal of Medical Anthropology article from 2004, where